Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of True Crime with Caitlyn. Today we're going to be talking about an unsolved case which is actually incredibly local to me, taking place in Darlington, County Durham. A case about a woman who was minding her own business, sunbathing, soaking up the sun in the comfort of her own garden when she was senselessly murdered. This is the unsolved murder of Anne Heron. Mary Ann O'Neill, who went by Anne, was born in Scotland, March 1946. When she was around 18 or 19 years old, she would marry her first husband, Ralph Coburn, and the couple would go on to have 3 lovely children together. Anne would be described as a doting mother. She loved kids, she loved animals, she loved everyone. She had so much love to give, and she herself was lovable. She was so kind and laid back. She loved music, she loved going on holidays and travelling, especially to Canada to visit family that she had over there. Despite being married for so long, sadly as the years went on, the happy marriage that Anne and Ralph once had began to disappear. They were falling out of love with each other, which I can imagine is a devastating thing to accept. Anne, however, would unexpectedly reignite that flame with someone else. In 1979, 43-year-old married father of 3, Peter Heron, was on a lads golfing trip on the Isle of Bute, Scotland, when he got talking to 33-year-old Anne Coburn, and there were fireworks between the two. They had an instantaneous spark and attraction to one another. Despite both Anne and Peter being married for many years at this point, Anne had been married for 15 years and Peter 20, they were both unhappy in their current relationships, and just feeling that spark, that instant connection with someone else so easily and effortlessly felt amazing. After the golfing trip, Peter and Anne kept in touch, and when Anne went down to England to visit a friend, she met up with Peter, and this is when they began a physical relationship. Not long afterwards, they would both break off their marriage and began a relationship together, and moving down to England, leaving behind her 3 children, which was incredibly hard for her to do. In a documentary that I watched, her daughter, Anne-Marie, spoke about how hard this was for her to do, but she had been unhappy for so long that it was hard to shield it from her children, who weren't toddlers, by the way, they were in their teenage years at least. Anne didn't take the decision lightly, and any other parents out there know how hard it is to put yourself before your children, so I think that speaks to just how unhappy Anne really was that she made the decision to up and move hundreds of miles away from her children. Anne and Peter would marry in 1986 in a chapel in Darlington, followed by an extravagant after-do at Wynyard Hall, and by all accounts they had a lovely, happy marriage. The families blended well. Peter's daughters absolutely adored Anne. She was like a second mother to them. She was so caring and nurturing, and even Anne's daughter would come down from Scotland to live with them for a while and loved it, loved seeing her mother so happy. They also got a family dog, a collie named Heidi. The couple purchased a luxurious home named Aeolian House, which had a road leading up to it, 4 bedrooms, a balcony, and tons of land surrounding it. It was beautiful greenery and trees. The house is sort of isolated, sitting by itself in the middle of fields, situated just off the A67 road, which is just outside of Middleton, St George, Darlington. I've drove past it several times and it's truly a breathtaking home. I will have a picture of it posted on Instagram at TrueCrimeCaitlyn, so you can go ahead and take a look and see what I mean by it's sort of isolated. The summer of 1990, the UK was experiencing a heat wave like no other, temperatures reaching up to 37 degrees. The heat caused wildfires in the moors, fuel tanks to explode, and somewhere had a wax figure of Margaret Thatcher, and the head of the figure began to melt, so they had to decapitate decapitate the wax figure and put the head in a fridge to stop it from melting. Friday the 3rd of August was the hottest recorded day, and it would also be the worst day of Anne's friends, family and loved ones' lives. The day started off as ordinary as every other. Peter woke up early to go to work as a company director for a nearby haulage firm, wearing a beige light-coloured suit and a white shirt. Anne, who worked as a part-time care assistant, had the day off today, so she filled her morning popping into Darlington Centre with a friend and hitting the shops. She was invited to a colleague's birthday party that evening, and so she wanted to pick up something nice for them. She would get back to Aeolian House just before 1 p.m. so that she could be home ready for Peter coming back from work for his dinner. He was a bit of a creature of habit and always came home for a cup of soup and a sandwich. The couple sat outside together while Peter ate his dinner, and then he left just before 2 p.m. Anne was just like so many people I know. She was a sun chaser. She loved to lounge in the sun, topping up her tan, and with a spare couple of hours before she needed to get ready for the party, she did just that. Changing into a bikini, pulling out the sunbed, grabbing her book, she was reading The Ghost Flight of 401, a book about a dead pilot who haunts aeroplanes, her portable radio, a drink, and lay in the garden soaking up the sun with Heidi by her side. She spoke on the phone with one of her friends at around about 2:30 p.m. They were arranging to meet outside the pub that night so that they could go into the party together, and this friend sensed nothing wrong with Anne. She was her usual cheery, happy self. That friend would be the last person that Anne spoke to. As I mentioned earlier, Aeolian House was and is surrounded by fields, and the farmer who owned the field out the back of the house was cutting the grass and getting dust all over Anne, so she pulled all her gear to the front of the house to get out the way. So now she is sunbathing where she would be visible to drivers on the A67 road. A witness would later recall seeing Anne lounging in her front garden at around about 3:30 p.m, and that would be the last confirmed sighting of her. Just a side note that too, throughout this episode, I'm not going to talk about all of the witnesses who reported sightings, specifically the ones that have been completely ruled out. For example, in 2008, a witness told the Northern Echo that they saw Anne and Peter in a car, that they flashed them and waved at them at around about 4:15 p.m, but that was completely ruled out because Peter had a rock solid alibi. So I just want to mention that I'm not going to be discussing every single potential sighting because there is so many, just in case you're familiar with this case and you're wondering why I'm not mentioning all the other sightings, because again, there is a few. Shortly after 6 p.m, Peter Heron would arrive back at Aeolian House, expecting to see Anne dressed to the nines, ready to head out for the party. When he approached the house, some things caught him off guard as weird, but he didn't think into them too much. For example, still sat outside in the garden was Heidi. All of Anne's sunbathing bits were there, and the front door was wide open. Peter probably thought that she had just ran inside for something quickly because that's how it would have looked. When he walked towards and into the house, again, it was really strange because Anne didn't come and greet him, which she did every single night. Peter called out for Anne, but was met with silence. He would walk through the house and into the living room, and that is where he would see the horrifying scene that is now engraved into his memory. There was 44-year-old Anne, loving, kind, caring, beautiful Anne who would do anything for anyone, lay face down in a pool of blood on the living room floor. Her bikini bottoms had been removed and discarded nearby her body. Anne's throat had been slit several times and she sustained a total of 4 stab wounds. In a state of complete shock and horror, praying that this wasn't what it looked like, Peter went to Anne, and I couldn't find exactly what he did. I don't believe that he moved her, but he may have shoved her a little bit to try and wake her up to see if there was any sign of life. But when she didn't respond, he went to the phone and rang 999. He would also call up his boss, who was also a close friend, and he arrived at Aeolian House very quickly. When he arrived, Peter was stood outside, and in the documentary that I watched, Peter described asking his boss to go in and tell him that what he saw wasn't true, that Anne wasn't laying motionless and cold in a pool of blood. But when this friend went into the house and came back out and wrapped his arms around Peter, he knew that it was true. When the police arrived, of course, they wouldn't let Peter back inside. Aeolian House was now a crime scene. Small spots of blood were found on Peter, on his light-coloured suit, but they were accounted for, consistent with him touching Anne in some way, and her blood would also be found on the phone, which was consistent with Peter touching Anne and then using the phone to call for help. Over the next few days, police would comb through the land surrounding Aeolian House, hoping to find something, some clue about who had done this, and maybe even the murder weapon. But to this day, the murder weapon has never been recovered. Now, this isn't explicitly said anywhere in any of me research, this is just what I think, but the killer must have came to the house armed, because I didn't read anything anywhere that indicated that knives or scalpels or anything that could have caused these injuries to Anne were missing from the house. So that must mean the killer came armed. The police stopped hundreds of drivers on the A67 just outside of Aeolian House to question them. Did they drive this road often? Did they drive on it on the 3rd of August? And if so, did they see anything? Anne's autopsy would be conducted, and the pathologist found that Anne's cause of death was hemorrhage and shock due to blood loss. It was estimated that she was murdered around about the 5 p.m. mark, and there were no signs of sexual assault. So this raises the question, why were her bikini bottoms removed? The pathologist was able to extract a minute amount of semen DNA, but this was 1990, so they just didn't have the technology to do anything with the sample at the time. Statistics back then and even now show that when someone is murdered, usually the victim knows their killer, and for this case, the police didn't think any different. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, and inside there was no sign of a struggle either, which indicated that maybe Anne knew our killer and allowed them into the house. Through inquiries, they understood that no one had reported Heidi barking, which is something that you would assume she would do if a stranger approached them, and even more so if a stranger was attacking her beloved owner. It's believed that Heidi had slept throughout the entire murder. Aeolian House is also a place that you have to go deliberately. There is a full-on road that leads up to it, so you wouldn't just accidentally end up there in passing. You have to drive up the road in order to get to the house. As not only the closest person to Anne, her husband, but also the man who found her body, of course the police were curious if Peter had any involvement. He provided the investigators with an alibi. At around about 3:45 p.m, he drove to Cleveland Bridge Limited, which is only about a 4-minute drive from Aeolian House, in his car, where he sat for a meeting for about an hour with 4 other people who verified that he was there. After the meeting, now around 4:45 p.m, he drove back to his office, but instead of going the direct route, which would have took a couple of minutes, he drove the long way around, going through 2 villages before eventually getting back to his office. That was suspicious to police, and of course many others, because 15 minutes before his wife is murdered, he is in the car driving the long way back to work. When he arrived at the office, he looked just the same as he had when he left. He hadn't changed out of his beige light-coloured suit. Now, I am jumping ahead a little bit here, but many people did and still do suspect that Peter is the killer. But if he did leave that meeting at around about 4:45 p.m. and drove the 4 minutes to Aeolian House, he may have had time to commit the murder, but why wouldn't he have changed his suit? Anne had been stabbed a total of 4 times, including many slits to the throat, so you would have thought he would have got some blood on him, but he didn't. When he got back to the office, he was wearing the exact same light beige coloured suit as he was wearing when he had left. It genuinely breaks my heart to think that if he had thought to have popped home, maybe he could have saved Anne, maybe he could have caught the murderer in their house and prevented anything from happening, and maybe the murderer wouldn't have even tried to attack Anne, seeing that somebody else, a man, was there. A couple of days after Anne's murder, the police would get their first proper lead. A family who were driving along the A67 at around about 5 o'clock on their way to the beach on the 3rd of August were passing by Aeolian House when a blue Ford car sped down the path leading up to the house and dangerously pulled onto the road. This driver wanted to leave that house and sharp. The driver was described as being between 35 and 45-year-old. It was a man. He was suntanned with dark hair. A taxi driver would report similar. He was driving along the road when he was overtaken by a blue car going at ridiculous speed, and a lorry driver did as well. The driver of this blue Ford car made the lorry driver think that he was going to hit him, so the lorry driver swerved out of its way, and all of them had a similar description of the man, but police never created a photo fit of him to broadcast. They did interview around about 3,500 people who owned cars that matched the description, the blue Ford cars, but nothing came of the interviews. They received reports of a suspicious blue van with 3 men sat inside being parked nearby Aeolian House. Police appealed for them to come forward, but they never did. They also received reports about a man who was spotted jogging nearby Aeolian House, and again, police appealed for him to come forward, but he never did either. Peter Heron would be the centre of a conference where he begged anyone to come forward with information. He said in part, quote, "I appeal not for my sake, but for Anne's sake. She was a beautiful lass. She would not know how to hurt anybody. Her eyes sparkled. Nobody could fail to love Anne. It was the best time of my life when I met her 10 years ago." And he warned that this killer could strike again, and next time it could be their wife, it could be their daughters, sisters, friends, and he must be stopped before he can strike again. He even put up a £5,000 reward, but this appeal only generated leads that led to nowhere. Despite the public initially feeling sympathy for Peter, who appeared devastated, quickly opinions on him would shift when it was revealed that Peter had been having an affair. It came out that Peter Heron had been involved with a 32-year-old married woman who he had met because she worked as a barmaid at his golf club, and their affair had gone on for 10 months. He and Anne had only just celebrated their 3-year wedding anniversary when Peter began cheating on her, cheating on a woman who absolutely doted on him. This was alarming because Peter had never told the police about the affair, which is the type of thing that he should have told them, because what if the affair was part of the motive? The 32-year-old woman, who has remained anonymous, would describe their affair as, quote, "a fling, a bit of attention and some excitement." The two would travel down to London together, where they'd go to fancy restaurants before going back to the hotel and sleeping together. Peter would say that this wasn't any sort of serious affair, it wasn't anything that was going to lead anywhere, and he claimed that it only happened twice. After this was broadcasted, public perception of Peter completely changed, and he was branded as a murderer, which he profusely denied. A couple of weeks later, when Peter was allowed back to Aeolian House, his daughters offered to go in and clean the place for him, freshen it up a little bit, and while they were doing so, one of his daughters, Debbie, noticed a blue car sat at the end of the road with a man inside who was glaring at the house. She, obviously aware that the police were looking for a man in a blue car, stormed outside down the gravelly path and bravely confronted the man, asking him, "What does he want? What is he doing?" To which he replied, quote, "That man ruined my life." It turned out that this man was the husband of the 32-year-old woman that Peter had been having an affair with. Police never suspected this man of being a suspect. He had a solid alibi that held up, and the colour of his car just happened to be a sheer coincidence. By the time it reached the 1-year anniversary of Anne's murder, sadly the police were no further forward, but not for a lack of trying. They had taken over 4,000 statements, followed 5,500 lines of inquiry, conducted over 4,000 interviews, recovered over 1,200 forensic examples, but nothing was getting them any closer to the perpetrator. From all accounts, Anne seemed like a blameless, likeable woman who had no enemies. She wasn't into any funny business or anything nefarious. She wasn't involved in any affairs or anything that could give police a hint on what the motive for the murder could have been. Nothing was stolen from Aeolian House. There was no sexual assault, and it seemed that the murder was just a harrowing crime of opportunity. Someone evil had seen Anne sunbathing in her bikini, relaxing, and decided to rip her life away from her. Sometime after the murder, police, Peter, and the Northern Echo newspaper all began receiving strange handwritten letters by someone who was claiming to be the killer. As far as I could find, only one letter has been publicly released, and it reads, quote, "Hello editor, it's me, Anne Heron's killer. I'm local. I enjoyed it so much. I love hurting people, physically and mentally. I've dropped the bastards at Parkgate a line and have sent Mr. Peter Heron letters explaining myself. I don't owe anyone any apologies. Your readers will have plenty to talk about. Signed, the killer." The letters were locally postmarked, so the person sending the letter was telling the truth about being local. However, if they were in fact the killer, they were shown absolutely no remorse, and then them explaining how much they enjoyed murdering Anne was worrying, because what if they wanted to do it again? The other letters have been described as having vivid and important details inside. Could this be details that only were known by the killer? I don't know how much stock was put into these letters, because only years before, when trying to catch Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper, police spent a lot of time tracing down letters by someone who was dubbed as Wearside Jack, and they turned out to be a hoax, wasting valuable time. But I can imagine that the police in this case did investigate as necessary, especially if it included non-reported details. Peter's daughter Debbie would describe how Peter's world totally crashed after Anne's murder, and that he probably fell into a depression. He lived with her for some time and she looked after him, making sure that he would eat and get out the house, etc. She would stick up for him when he would receive dirty looks in the pubs and heckles from people calling him a murderer, which sometimes even came from teenagers. However, Peter would find a light, and that came in the form of Frida Buddy. Frida was a 49-year-old widowed receptionist who Peter met through work while on a work trip. They got married in January 1993, however only a few years later, Frida was sadly diagnosed with cancer, and while she fought it, she and Peter moved back to Motherwell in Scotland, which is where Frida was originally from. Peter looked after her until she passed away in July 2005. On the morning of Frida's funeral, the police would call Peter, and months later, they would make their first arrest in connection with Anne's murder. In the 15 years since Anne Heron's murder, DNA technology came on leaps and bounds. So in 2005, the microscopic semen DNA that was extracted from her body was able to be tested, and they got a match. On the 9th of November 2005, 6 police officers would arrive at the home of 70-year-old Peter Heron and arrested him on suspicion of the murder of his wife, Anne. Over the course of the next day and a half, he would be vigorously interviewed for 10 hours without any legal representation because he didn't want it. Peter refused to have a solicitor because he said that he knew he didn't do it and he had nothing to hide. He was innocent and he was going to cooperate to the full extent, answering each and every question they had. It would be his daughter Debbie who finally convinced him to get a solicitor. Guilty or innocent, this is something that you should always do. So, what did the police have on him? His DNA was found on Anne's body, which if it was a complete stranger, that would be a total red flag, but this was her husband. They also had a quote-unquote surprise witness who ID'd Peter as being at the scene. The witness was sat at a roundabout close to Aeolian House and saw who he believed was Peter Heron erratically driving a car, flashing his headlights, and specifically described seeing Peter's dentures swishing about in his mouth. But Peter didn't have dentures, not then, and not even when he was arrested. And the time that this witness gave police, Peter was literally sat in the middle of a meeting with several other people. Plus, they couldn't really figure out a motive. Peter had absolutely nothing to gain from murdering Anne. The affair would have been the most obvious, but if he wanted to separate or divorce Anne, she probably would have tried to fight for their marriage, but not to the extent where he would have to kill her to get rid of her. She had a whole other life up Scotland with her children away from Darlington, so she could have just went back to her old life. Peter would be held in custody for 7 days before being bailed, and only 12 weeks later, the murder charge was dropped due to lack of evidence. He wasn't acquitted though. Peter never got his day in court and deemed not guilty, which is something that he really wanted. He wanted the dark cloud of suspicion taken away from him, but he never got it. Also, this is a side note, but he was never actually told about the charges being dropped by police or anyone like that, at least not initially. He found out when 2 reporters knocked on his door and asked him if he had any comments to make about the charges being dropped, which absolutely blindsided him because he had no idea that they had been dropped. The investigation into Anne Heron's murder became stagnant. New leads were few and far between, but yielded no different results. Her killer was still out there. In 2016, Debbie, who again is Peter's daughter, would receive a Facebook message from a woman named Jen Jarvie. Jen is a private cold case investigator who became really interested in Anne's case, and she wanted to lend a hand in helping to solve it pro bono, and she believes that she has. Developing a profile on the killer, Jen believed that she was looking for a serial offender. The crime was sophisticated to an extent. They managed to leave behind no DNA or anything that would trace back to them, and it seemed too ferocious to be a first offence. The killer was a confident person, someone who drove up to Aeolian House in broad daylight, murdered Anne, and then fled. Jen didn't believe that this was a person who would stop at one victim. She combed through the Crime Watch footage that aired in the October after Anne's murder, and she also watched the November episode. In this episode, the police were appealing for information regarding the whereabouts of a man who escaped from prison. This man was 40-year-old Michael Benson, who had been incarcerated several times for crimes including committing a robbery with a carving knife, grievous bodily harm with a shotgun, and attempted murder. He was on a day release from Home House Prison, which is situated only 20 miles away from Aeolian House, when he disappeared, stealing his wife's blue Ford car. For anyone who hasn't already looked at the pictures that I posted on Instagram, Michael looks like a 40-year-old. He is tanned and has dark hair. He shares those features with the man who several witnesses saw fleeing Aeolian House, and both of them were driving blue Ford cars. In July 1990, so a fortnight before Anne's murder, in Durham city centre, while walking along the weir, 2 women would be attacked by a man who they described as being about 30 years old, tanned and having black hair. A photo fit was created of this attacker, and Jen believes that it resembles Michael Benson. It could be him, and if it was, this puts him in Durham in the weeks leading up to Anne's murder. After the 30-year anniversary of the crime, there was extensive coverage of the case, and following this, Jen would be approached by an ex-prisoner of Home House Prison. He was incarcerated with Michael Benson, and he claimed that Michael Benson confessed that he murdered Anne Heron. He had seen the case coverage on the 30th anniversary and put 2 and 2 together and realised that this is who Michael was talking about. At the time when Michael was confessing to this ex-prisoner thought that Michael was just trying to big himself up in the prison hierarchy of things, but maybe he wasn't. Michael described how he was looking for somewhere to rob when he came across a house, which he described, how he went up the drive, and how he murdered a woman, saying, quote, "I just did her and went." 2 things there ring true with Anne's case. He would have had to drive up a road to get to a house, and Anne was murdered, but there wasn't a sexual assault or a burglary involved. The ex-prisoner, who has remained anonymous and stated that he had no intentions of trying to claim any sort of reward or anything, signed what is called a statement of truth about Michael Benson's confession. When approached, Michael Benson's wife also took a look at the handwriting from the letters that were sent to the newspaper, to the police, police and to Peter, and she said without a shadow of doubt that this handwriting matched the handwriting of Michael Benson. Jen took all of this information to police, who haven't investigated it, despite all of the little pieces that seemingly add up. They released a statement regarding this, saying, quote, "There is no evidence to place Michael Benson in the area around the time of this offence. We are all but certain Michael Benson was living abroad at the time of the murder. Michael Benson is not and has never been a suspect in this case." Michael Benson was never recaptured, and it's reported that he died in 2011. This August will mark 35 years since Anne Heron was senselessly murdered. Her family, friends and loved ones are all desperate for answers, for closure. In August 2023, her son released a statement saying, quote, "I know there are people out there who know something about what happened that day. You might think that the info you have is insignificant, but trust me, even the smallest detail could be a game changer. It might just be that missing puzzle piece that we need to finally catch our mum's killer." Anne's case is still open. If you have any information, you can report it to Durham Constabulary via 101, anonymously via Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111 or via the portal, web linked at https://operation.police.uk/11X43-PO1. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. Please don't forget to follow the podcast wherever you're listening and leave me a 5-star rating. Make sure to head over to Instagram at TrueCrimeCaitlyn, where you can see pictures relating to today's case and any and all updates. Drop a comment on my latest post and tell me your thoughts about this case.